Hey, Composition of a Killer fans, Dr. Cassidy here. Today we're going to be talking about some of our most gruesome juvenile serial killers. It's not something that we think about very often. When you think of a serial killer, you typically think of a male in their early 20s all the way up to their 50s or 60s. We rarely see or hear about, juveniles with this kind of behavior. Before we begin, as always, I want to just make sure that you understand that nothing that we discuss in this podcast is meant to be a clinical diagnosis. We are talking about their early childhoods. We are trying to understand the trauma associated with what happened to them in hopes of preventing these things from happening in the future with the young students that we have now. So we're going to start out. There's about 17 that I've researched so far, which certainly means that I'm going to have to do several podcasts. We can't get all of that in within an hour. So we're going to start out with Jesse Pomeroy. He is known as the Boy Fiend of Boston, and as far back as the late 1800s, he was actually born November 29th of 1859. We had reports of serial killers and reports of certainly this one, the juvenile serial killer. But now they weren't called serial killers back then. That was coined by, I believe, the FBI, where they made those distinctions between mass murder, a mass murderer, or a serial killer. There's several different categories, and it depends on how they do it. And, if they kill, obviously a mass murder would be like our school shootings that we've seen where they go in and they kill a bunch of people at the same time. Serial killer is someone who kills systematically over the course of time. And it doesn't matter how much time. It's just if you've killed, 2 or more people over the course of time, you're considered a serial killer. So that's what we're looking at here. Now, honestly, this guy, Jesse Pomeroy, is known mostly for his sadistic deeds. He was, by his 15th birthday, he would become the youngest person convicted of first-degree murder in the history of Massachusetts. And as a child, he was ridiculed because he had a facial deformity. His right cornea was covered with a thick white film. I'm thinking it might have been like cataract. That's what it reminds me of. I'm just trying to imagine that, but I'm not even sure they knew what cataracts were back then. So it was considered a facial deformity. It's reported that he kept to himself mostly, reading dime store novels full of macabre tales instead of playing with the neighborhood kids or his older brother Charles. Jesse's father, Thomas Pomeroy, was an alcoholic and physically abused his son, whipping him regularly. Jesse's mother, Ruth Ann Pomeroy, sympathized with Jesse, but did little to stop the abuse. And that is very indicative of, first of all, battered women's syndrome. I'm sure if he was physically abusive to the children, he was probably physically abusive to her as well. And culturally, it was very different back in the 1800s. The father, the male figure in the family, usually was the breadwinner, and there weren't very many opportunities for women. So she probably stayed with him because she would not have a sufficient way to raise herself and her, children without him. Very, very common story. Although she does change that later on, I'm happy to say. It was this dismal environment that, of course, we believe had this severely negative effect on Jesse. At age 12, he lashed out the only way he knew how, and that was by bullying those smaller and weaker than him. And again, here we see bullying, right? Bullying is literally a form of self-preservation. You want to get the person before they get you. You want to, show your control, show your power before they get a chance to do it. And that's why we see movies and all these things where someone stands up to a bully and then they back off. That's the way it works in a perfect world, but that is not the way it works all the time. Sometimes bullies are, in this case, they're just so sadistic and they enjoy that humiliation and that fear that they create that really nothing is going to make them back down. And so I think that's what we have in this case with Jesse. In the winter of 1871, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, reports surfaced of young boys being viciously assaulted by a mysterious attacker. Unbeknownst to the community in the Boston Globe, which referred to the perpetrator as the Red Devil and the boy torturer, the culprit was Jesse Pomeroy. From the beginning, his attacks were disturbing, not just mirroring the drunken beatings he received from his father, but taking them one sadistic step further. This is that cycle that we talk about. This is that cycle. We talk about a cycle of poverty. We talk about cycle of violence. You typically will raise your children as you've been raised, unless you have, some intervention along the way where it goes completely the opposite way, where you say, I will never raise my children that way. And you are incredibly protective of them. You've seen both. I mean, we see people who have continued that cycle of violence, and it's sad. It's a horrible thing, and it's almost impossible to break. But then you also see on the flip side families who have really thrived and tried their best to get out of those situations and create a different environment for their family. And that's what we want to see. So what is the difference between these two families? What caused this one person to decide, this is enough. I'm changing my life. My children will not be treated this way. I'm going to raise them a different way, blah, blah, blah. Compared to the person who continues, smacking their kids around or whatever method they use to promote fear, and the end result of that would be, of course, to obey their rules. And so what's the difference? What is the difference between those two people? What happened that changed that mindset of the one who has now become a successful family member who does not, commit violence towards his family? What happened? That in and of itself is a whole other, you could literally spend an entire career just on that subject. So some of what Jesse did was he would exploit the innocent nature of his young victims, promising them candy and money to lure them away. Once he got them alone, he forced the children to strip naked, whereupon he whipped and beat them unconscious. As the number of victims grew, his methods became more brutal. He used knives and pins to slash their bodies and slit their faces, even sexually assaulting them. The terrified children reported how their attackers smiled and laughed throughout the ordeal. Keep in mind, up to this point, he didn't kill anybody. He was certainly a sexual predator and a horrible person. To prey on, the innocent like this. But he hadn't killed anybody yet. But you can see it progressively is getting worse. He starts out by just whipping and beating them unconscious after he strips them naked. And why do you think he stripped them naked? I'll give you a second to think about it. Typically, that is a form of humiliation. It shows a lot of power. Imagine being naked in front of someone who is assaulting you or going to assault you. You feel very vulnerable. You can't hide behind your clothes. So that is a tactic that is used by bullies, used by abusive people. Stripping someone of their clothing is stripping them of some form of protection, and it really is humiliating as well. So there were witnesses to these attacks, and those witnesses, thank goodness, they talked, right? They said that in the reports, they said that the attacker, Jesse, smiled and laughed throughout the entire ordeal. Now, when Jesse's mother came across the reports, she feared she knew just who was behind the assaults, and in an attempt to protect her son, she moved the family from Chelsea to South Boston. Subsequently, the attacks in Chelsea ceased and began again in South Boston, where Jesse continued down his dark road of violence. That is also one way that we catch serial killers and we find their territories. Ted Bundy is a good example of that. They would have, wherever he lived, there was an increase in attacks on women. And then when he would leave, it would decrease. Those numbers of attacks would decrease. Now, they didn't know that right off the bat because they didn't have him as a suspect. But once he was identified as a suspect, they could go back and trace where he had been and make those connections. And that's powerful evidence. Sometimes it's circumstantial, but circumstantial evidence has convicted thousands of people. Thousands of people. Keep in mind, this is in the 1800s. There's not going to be video cameras picking things up. There's not DNA evidence. They didn't have the advanced technology. They didn't have, the knowledge that our investigators have today. So they really were just waiting for the next thing to happen, so that whoever was doing it would mess up, or whoever was attacked could positively ID that person to the point where they could find them, arrest them, and convict them. But his mother moved him, and he began targeting those local children there in much the same way, luring them with promises of sweets to desolate train tracks or the beach. In August of 1872, a young boy was discovered brutalized and abandoned along the shore of Boston Harbor. A few weeks later, a 5-year-old, Robert Gould, was found bound to a telephone pole, stabbed and bleeding, and he was also sexually assaulted. But again, he didn't kill anybody yet. Despite the trauma that Robert suffered, Robert Gould is the 5-year-old we just discussed, he was able to describe his attacker honing in on the cloudy right eye, which would be the equivalent probably of someone having a tattoo today, right? If you could identify like a neck tattoo or a hand or wherever, tattoos, that's a great way to remember special characteristics about a person. And for a 5-year-old to be able to do that, crazy. So at the age of 13, Jesse was caught. Soon thereafter, turning 13, a juvenile court found Pomeroy guilty of the attacks and sent him to the State Reform School of Westboro, where he remained until he turned 18 years old. And normally we would hope to see this is the end of the story with Jesse. He spent his time in, juvenile hall. He was hopefully reformed, and we would, that would be the end of his tirade, right? Certainly that was not the case. Jesse had one person in his life who was his champion, and that was his mother. And she did everything she could to get her son released, even striking up affairs with influential police officers, but that didn't help. It didn't prove successful. In February of 1874, the state agreed to release Jesse into Ruth Ann's guardianship. So he became, in 74, a free young man. By now, Jesse's abusive father was out of the picture.